Hey there. Today we're going to be diving into a topic that's absolutely crucial to American life, education. You sent us a ton of really interesting stuff, articles, research, even some of your own personal reflections.
Yeah, lots to dig into.
It seems like you're really grappling with this question of how centralized our approach to education in the U.S. should be, especially when we think about the roles of the federal government versus individual states.
Right, that balance of power is a big one.
So for this deep dive, let's try to pull out the most important points from everything you've shared. Then we can really get a better picture of what might happen if education were solely a state responsibility. No more federal involvement, which I know is something you're particularly concerned about.
It's a fascinating question. And while the U.S. doesn't have a totally centralized education system, like, where the federal government calls all the shots, like some other countries do.
Right, it's more of a mix, isn't it?
Exactly. But that interplay between federal and state levels, that's key. And your research really highlights a central concern about what could happen if that federal role were to disappear completely, a concern I know you share.
Yeah, the potential for huge inequalities across states.
Exactly. So let's unpack that.
Okay, so maybe we should start with a quick overview of how things work right now.
Mm,
It's not like each state is totally on its own when it comes to education, right?
definitely not.
Your research points out that states have a lot of control. Like, they handle most of the day-to-day stuff and a good chunk of curriculum decisions.
Right.
But the federal government still plays a pretty significant role, doesn't it? Like with funding.
Oh, absolutely. Funding is huge. And it often comes with strings attached,
Yeah.
meaning states have to meet certain standards or work towards national goals to get that federal money.
I see. So it's not just a blank check.
Nope. For example, a lot of federal funding is geared towards boosting STEM education, science, technology, engineering, math. It's a national priority. Or ensuring equity in education for all students.
So the feds are using their financial muscle to kind of nudge things in certain directions. Makes sense.
Exactly. And the sources you've gathered point out that it's not just about the money. We also have to consider the impact of landmark civil rights legislation.
Oh, right. That's federal too, isn't it?
Absolutely. Laws like the Civil Rights Act, the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and of course, IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act.
Those are biggies.
Huge. They basically guarantee equal access to education for all students, regardless of race, disability, you name it. It's a nationwide standard that every single state has to uphold.
So that creates a kind of baseline level of equality across the country.
Exactly. Like, take IDEA, for instance. It mandates that every state has to provide individualized education programs, IEPs, for students with disabilities.
Right, IEP.
And that's federally enforceable, which means that no matter what a state's individual resources are or what its priorities might be,
They have to provide those services.
they have to. It's the law. And it ensures that students with disabilities get at least a basic level of support no matter where they live in the U.S.
Got it. So the feds are involved through funding and through these big overarching legal frameworks.
Right. But your research also brings up another important player, the Department of Education.
Okay, so what about them? They don't actually dictate what's taught in each state, do they?
Not directly, but they're still really influential. They set national education goals, promote specific initiatives.
So they kind of guide the conversation about what good education should look like.
Exactly. And they're also a major hub for data collection and research.
So they're keeping tabs on how things are going across different states.
Right. Which helps to paint a bigger picture of what's working and what isn't. It's really this interwoven system. States have a lot of control, but the feds have these levers they can pull.
Okay, so that's how it works now. But the big question that keeps coming up in all your sources, the one that seems to be keeping you up at night is, what if we yanked away all those federal levers? What if we just let each state do its own thing with absolutely no federal involvement?
What would happen?
Exactly. And the overwhelming message from all these articles and reports is that it would probably lead to a whole lot more inequality.
Yeah, I think you're picking up on a major theme here. And it's a worry, for sure.
And a lot of that worry seems to stem from the fact that states have vastly different levels of wealth.
Oh, for sure. That's a major factor.
Like one article you sent had this mind-blowing stat. It said that the 10 wealthiest states spend, on average, way more per student than the 10 poorest states do. It's a massive gap.
And if you took away federal funding, which often helps to even things out a bit,
That gap would probably become a chasm.
most likely. And that translates directly into fewer resources for schools in poorer states. Things like hiring qualified teachers, buying up-to-date textbooks and materials. All that stuff costs money.
Yeah, and the research you've highlighted shows a pretty clear link between funding and how well students perform. So, less money often means kids are getting a worse education.
It's a tough reality.
Some of your sources really painted a vivid picture of this potential disparity. Like, imagine one state, a rich one, investing in state-of-the-art science labs, offering tons of specialized programs, attracting the best teachers with competitive salaries.
Right, sounds ideal.
Then picture another state,
Right.
maybe one that's struggling economically. They can barely afford basic textbooks, the school buildings are falling apart.
That's the nightmare scenario, a two-tiered system where your zip code determines the quality of education you get.
And that's not just some hypothetical fear. The economic realities of different states are stark.
Absolutely. And relying solely on state revenues for education would almost certainly mean that those economic differences would turn into educational differences.
Right, because a state's budget reflects its overall financial health.
Exactly. So we'd likely see huge discrepancies in teacher salaries, how qualified teachers are, what kind of support services are available for students with special needs.
Or even just the basic upkeep of schools.
Yeah, all of that.
Now, beyond money, your sources also pointed out another potential issue. The fact that states have different cultures, different values, and different priorities.
Oh, yeah, that's huge.
And when it comes to something as fundamental as education, those differences could lead to pretty dramatic variations in what kids are actually learning.
Absolutely. One state might really emphasize the arts and humanities, have amazing music programs, focus on critical thinking and writing.
While another state might be all about STEM,
Yeah.
super focused on math and science, prepping kids for tech careers.
Right. And imagine a student moving from that artsy state to the STEM-focused one.
They'd be totally lost.
Well, maybe not lost, but they might face some real challenges catching up.
Or imagine applying to college. Admissions officers would be looking at applications from kids who've had wildly different educational experiences. How would they even compare them?
It would be incredibly difficult. And honestly, it would probably be unfair to a lot of students. It's like comparing apples and oranges.
And then there's the whole issue of religion, which, as your sources point out, could get really complicated in a system where states have total control over education.
Oh, for sure.
Because the influence of different religious groups on what's taught in schools could vary a lot from state to state. Like, in some places, evolution might be a core part of the science curriculum.
But in other places, it might not be taught at all.
Right. Or it might be presented alongside other theories.
Exactly. Or take sex education. That's another one where religious views could play a big role in shaping what kids are or aren't learning.
So we could end up with a situation where what's considered acceptable to teach varies wildly from one state to the next.
Yeah. And that could create some real divisions, not just between states, but also within states.
You mean like conflicts between different communities?
Exactly. You could have students from different religious backgrounds or students from secular families.
All in the same school, but with totally different ideas about what should be taught.
Exactly. And that could lead to some pretty tense situations and potentially disadvantage some students down the line. Like if they move to a state with different values or apply to colleges with specific requirements.
Okay, so we've got money, we've got cultural values, we've got religion. Your sources also brought up another interesting concept. They called it a state's mental state regarding education.
Interesting term.
It's basically about how much importance a society places on education. Like some states seem to have this culture where academic achievement is really valued, where people are super invested in their schools.
Right. It's like education is top of mind for everyone. Parents, community members, politicians.
Exactly. And in those places, you're more likely to see people voting to raise taxes to support schools or volunteering their time to help out with educational programs.
Yeah, it's a real community effort.
But in other states, education might not be seen as such a high priority. Maybe there's less funding, less parental involvement, lower expectations overall.
And the concern is that this mental state would become even more pronounced if states had total control over education.
Like the gap between those who really prioritize education and those who don't would become wider.
Exactly. Which, again, would lead to more inequality. Because even if two states have similar levels of wealth, if one values education more than the other, it's going to invest more, and its students are likely to benefit more.
You know, it's interesting. A couple of your sources actually gave some real-world examples of this mental state idea playing out.
Oh, yeah? Like what?
Well, there were a few articles that talked about how in some states, Local communities consistently vote to increase property taxes, specifically to fund their schools, even when it means they have to pay more themselves.
Wow, that says a lot.
Right. It shows that education is something they're willing to put their money where their mouth is.
Absolutely. But then other sources highlighted states where it's the opposite, like any attempt to increase funding for education faces huge opposition.
Even if the schools are clearly struggling.
Yeah, it's like education isn't seen as a top priority compared to other things the state could be spending money on.
Which really underscores this idea that even if we had some kind of system to make sure all states were spending the same amount per pupil, it wouldn't necessarily guarantee equal opportunities, because the overall attitude towards education within a state would still play a huge role.
You're right, money's a big part of the equation, but it's not the only part.
Okay, so shifting gears a bit,
Hmm.
your research also talks a lot about this issue of transferability.
Meaning?
Like how easily students can move between states or apply to colleges in different states if their educational backgrounds are wildly different.
Yeah, that's a big one. Especially for people who move around a lot, for work or family reasons.
Or for kids who want to go to college out of state.
Exactly. And the sources you sent are pretty clear that if each state had its own completely independent set of standards and curricula,
It would be a logistical nightmare.
total chaos. Like, imagine a student who did a vocational program in high school, something like carpentry or auto mechanics.
Yeah.
They get their certificate, they graduate, but then they move to another state, and suddenly their skills and qualifications aren't recognized.
Because the standards are different.
Exactly. So they might not be able to get a job in their field or even continue their training without starting over.
Oh, wow. That's awful.
And it wouldn't just be vocational programs, it would be the same for academic courses, too.
Like a student who aced AP biology in one state might not be prepared for a college-level bio class in another state.
Exactly. And then think about college admissions.
Oh, yeah. That would be a mess.
A total mess. Colleges would be getting applications from students who've had vastly different educational experiences, different coursework, different grading systems, maybe even different graduation requirements.
How could they possibly evaluate them fairly?
They couldn't. And students would be at a huge disadvantage just because of where they happened to go to high school.
So it wouldn't just be about inequalities within states, it would be about inequalities between states.
Exactly.
Your sources also delved into the potential historical and lifelong consequences of a solely state-run system.
Long-term impacts, yeah.
And one example that really stuck with me was the one about all genders.
Right, the impact on different genders.
Yeah, historically, educational opportunities have been way more limited for women than for men. It wasn't that long ago that girls weren't even allowed to go to college in some places.
It's crazy to think about.
I know. But over time, things have gotten better.
Yeah.
And a lot of that progress has been driven by centralized efforts.
Like federal legislation.
Exactly. Like Title IX, which your sources specifically mention.
Which guarantees equal opportunities in education for all genders.
Right. It's been hugely important for girls and women.
Absolutely.
But the concern is that without that federal oversight, those gains could be eroded.
Because individual states might backslide into more traditional or even discriminatory practices.
Yeah, like pushing girls towards certain careers or making it harder for them to get the same educational opportunities as boys.
And it's not just about gender, of course. The same argument could be made for any group that's historically faced discrimination in education. Racial minorities, students with disabilities, LGBTQ+ students.
Right. Federal protections have been crucial for ensuring that everyone has a fair shot.
And without those protections, it's very possible that some states would revert to policies that disadvantage certain groups.
Okay, so we've talked about the potential impacts on different genders, on different groups, but your research also goes into how a solely state-run system might affect different age groups.
Starting with the youngest learners, actually.
Right, early childhood education.
Exactly. And here, the big worry is that unequal investment by states could create huge disadvantages for kids right from the start.
Because if some states pour a ton of money into early childhood programs, while others barely fund them at all.
You're setting up some kids for success and others for failure before they even set foot in a kindergarten classroom.
And all that research about how important high-quality preschool is?
It basically goes out the window if access to those programs is totally dependent on where you live.
And then, as kids move on to K-12, the sources you sent highlight how these disparities would play out in terms of college readiness, career readiness, even how prepared they are to participate in civic life.
Basically, their ability to function as informed, engaged citizens.
Exactly. Because if states have wildly different academic standards,
A high school diploma in one state might mean something totally different from a high school diploma in another state.
right, like in one state, graduating might mean you're totally prepared for college or for a high-tech job.
But in another state, maybe you're not even close.
And the sources really emphasized how this could play out in STEM fields. If some states have really weak science and math standards,
Those students are going to be at a serious disadvantage when it comes to competing for jobs or getting into top colleges.
which has implications not just for them as individuals, but for the whole country.
Right, because in a global economy, a nation's competitiveness depends on having a highly skilled workforce.
So if we're not producing enough graduates who are proficient in STEM fields,
We're going to fall behind.
now even higher education, which already has a lot of state-level control.
It still benefits from some degree of federal oversight, right?
Exactly. Your research points out that federal funding and accreditation standards play a role in maintaining consistency and quality across different institutions.
Yeah, it's like having a national benchmark.
So you know that a certain level of quality is being met no matter where you go to college.
But if the feds were totally out of the picture,
Who knows what would happen?
we could see a huge variation in the value of a college degree depending on what state you got it in.
Yeah, a degree in engineering from a university in one state might be highly respected by employers nationwide.
But a degree in the same field from a university in another state might not be worth the paper it's printed on.
And that would create a ton of confusion for students and employers alike.
Not to mention the impact on accreditation. Right now, there's a system in place that ensures colleges are meeting certain standards.
And that their degrees are recognized.
Exactly. But without federal involvement, that system could become much more fragmented and unreliable.
Oh, and we can't forget about adult education and job retraining programs, which are super important in today's economy.
Absolutely essential. People need to be able to adapt to changing job markets, learn new skills.
But if those programs were solely a state responsibility, you'd probably see huge disparities in access depending on where you live.
Right, because some states might invest heavily in those programs, recognizing their importance for economic growth.
But other states, especially those that are already struggling economically, might not be able to afford to prioritize them.
Which would leave a lot of people without the support they need to stay competitive in the workforce.
So we've talked about economic consequences, social consequences, even political consequences. But your research also touches on the potential cultural implications of a solely state-run system.
Right, like how it might affect our sense of national identity.
Exactly. Because if there are no national educational standards, there's a risk that certain cultures or perspectives might be marginalized in some states' curricula.
Yeah, like we could end up with very different versions of American history being taught depending on where you live.
Which could lead to a really fragmented understanding of our shared past and potentially undermine our sense of unity as a nation. And, zooming out even further, your sources remind us that education has always been a driving force behind human progress. Like, think about all the scientific breakthroughs, the technological innovations, the medical advancements.
All fueled by education.
Exactly. Education is what allows us to understand the world around us, to solve problems, to create new things.
It's essential for progress.
But if we were to fragment our educational system by letting each state set its own standards with no national framework,
It could actually slow down the pace of progress.
like imagine a world where scientists in different states are working from totally different sets of principles or using different methodologies.
It would make collaboration incredibly difficult. And it could hinder our ability to tackle big global challenges.
So it's not just about individual students or individual states. It's about the future of our country as a whole.
Yeah, the stakes are pretty high.
And finally, to kind of bring it all together, your research draws some pretty clear connections between these potential educational disparities under a solely state-run system.
And almost every aspect of American life.
Exactly. Like economically, we could end up with a less skilled workforce, less economic competitiveness. Socially, we could see less cohesion, more division. Politically, we could see less informed participation, less civic engagement. Culturally, we could see a fragmentation of our national culture. And on a personal level, people's opportunities in life would be greatly determined by where they happen to be born or where they grow up.
Yeah, the research really paints a stark picture of how deeply interconnected education is with everything else.
So to kind of circle back to where we started, you sent us all these materials because you were grappling with this question. What would happen if education in the U.S. was solely a state responsibility?
Right, a big what if.
And after really diving into all this research, I think the key takeaway is this. While there are valid arguments for giving states more autonomy in education, completely eliminating the federal role is a recipe for disaster.
It would likely exacerbate inequalities.
Exactly, because right now the system, while imperfect, at least tries to strike some kind of balance.
Between state flexibility and national standards, between local control and ensuring equal opportunities for all students.
But if we were to completely dismantle that balance, it would have far-reaching consequences for our country.
Absolutely, and not good ones.
So, as a final thought for you to consider, knowing all this, what elements of that balance do you think are most important to protect, or even to strengthen?
The vital question to think about.
Yeah, and it's a conversation we need to keep having, because the future of education in America depends on it.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening.
This is DigitView.